the Messianics Podcast, a podcast about all things Messianic Judaism. Each episode, we will be sharing our opinions as we tackle some of the biggest issues in Messianic Judaism. Now, here's your hosts, Rabbis Eric, David, Jonathan, and Toby.
Hey guys, thanks for joining us for another episode of the Messianics Podcast. We're going to dive into a bit of an interesting conversation, or at least I think it will be. These are always fun when we just kind of dive into something that's maybe not really been addressed before, or that we want to dive into just for random conversation. And the premise that started this idea was the very simple question: what do we like and or dislike about Messianic Judaism? And the conversation has now grown into something a little, probably a little more beneficial, a little more loving, but realistically, what we're kind of talking about is what brought us to Messianic Judaism. Not necessarily like our testimony, but what are the things that really spoke to us, that brought us to Messianic Judaism and have kept us in Messianic Judaism. So what are the things that we're doing well as a Messianic Jewish movement? And likewise, what are the improvements that we see could still be taken advantage of, and to kind of see the movement continue forward for generations to come? So not like a like versus dislike, like we're trying to beat down on anything particular, but
right.
But what can we do to improve the Messianic movement? If you go to any Messianic Jewish conference, and we've just come back from a few over the past 2 months, and summer always brings about the anthem of national conferences and so on, but when you go to Messianic Jewish conferences and even attending various Messianic congregations, what you realize is that the leadership of Messianic Judaism is definitely aging, and many of the pioneers of Messianic Judaism, especially in the congregational movement, are unfortunately at the tail end of their kind of time in leadership in Messianic Judaism, and not because like anybody's going to push them out, but just because lifespans are finite, and eventually we are not able to continue things on, and it's necessary to hand things over to a new generation to carry things in the further direction. And so, what are those areas? And especially sitting here where we've got Rabbi Eric, who has been involved in Messianic Judaism in leadership for 30-something years. I've been in leadership in Messianic congregations for about 21 years. But what we're also, Rabbi Jonathan, Rabbi Toby, and myself are on the younger end of things. Rabbi Jonathan much more so than Rabbi Toby and myself, but are on the younger end of things, and Rabbi Eric's on the fading into the sunset end of things. And no offense, but so what are the things that we see that are beneficial, that have blessed our lives, that have maintained our connectivity to the movement? And then what are the areas that we really could see improvement or would like to see improvement, and so on? And as always, our general policy is, if we have something negative to say about an individual or organization or what have you, we strive to try to not drop names, but rather just to generalize. And as always, if we're going to praise somebody, we want to make sure we praise the individual or organization or whatever. We want to make sure we praise them publicly with their name and such. So I guess probably as much saying that, if not more so, to myself than anybody else, as a friendly reminder.
We did have to have a 5-minute conversation before this about, like, what words we cannot use or use, and what socially we should be socially conscious of our audience. And there was a time in my life when I was just naive and ignorant with social cues, and now I just blatantly ignore them most of the time. So.
Well, and two of you were military, and military is not necessarily known for giving a crap about social norms.
No.
So
No.
So whoever wants to dive in.
Yeah, sorry. I was going to jump in and say, I think one of the things that I like about Messianic Judaism is also one of the things I dislike about it. And that is that if you go to the average Messianic synagogue or congregation, you'll find a blend of people from different backgrounds, different cultures, all blended together in the congregation. If you looked at our congregation...
Some might call it multicultural.
Yeah, multicultural. If you'll look at our congregation, we have people from all over the world all gathered together, and from different faith backgrounds. If you were to say, okay, everybody was a Methodist or a Baptist or a Catholic or whatever, or came from this branch of Judaism or that branch, you would get hands that went up all over the place within the congregation, and the same thing at CMC. You have a variety of cultures, you have a variety of faith backgrounds, a variety of age, from the smallest little babies to 90, 100-year-old people. So that's one of the things I like about Messianic Judaism. One of the things I don't like about it is the fact that sometimes we either pretend we're not that, or like to act as if we're not, or we push against that by saying, by focusing so much on Jewishness that we actually belittle those that aren't Jewish, or by focusing on one sect of Judaism, for instance, the European Ashkenazi background as opposed to the Sephardic background, or the Yemenite or the Mizrahi backgrounds, as if they're better than, so that we focus on that. And so we are one thing, but we try to demonstrate or act as if we're not, which is self-deceptive to me in a large way. And I'm not saying that happens at CMC or Bredon, but I'm talking about the Messianic movement overall.
Yeah.
That we're very welcoming of anybody that walks in the door in our synagogue in many places.
Especially if they're giving money.
Right. There are a few that will actually dissuade people if you're not Jewish or if you're not. But the majority of congregations are very welcoming of those from both Jewish backgrounds and non-Jewish backgrounds. But at the same time, there's this undercurrent of tribalism that I have an issue with. Not that the Bible doesn't talk to the Jew and equally the Greek. Not that those roles aren't important, and they're not that God didn't establish certain things and call the Jewish people so that through them He could call the nations that the Jews weren't. But that we add a value to Jewish souls that seems to devalue non-Jewish souls.
Or, and I'm going to throw this in and then I'm going to back out of this one. I'll let Rabbi Toby jump in. Or likewise, on the other side of that is the question that we often get as Messianic rabbis in Alabama and Northwest Florida is, are there even any Jews there? Because most Messianic synagogues tend to be, at least tend to be in metropolitan areas where there's massive Jewish communities. And as a matter of fact, we had that question, or at least I did. I don't remember if they asked you or not, but I was asked this question at the most recent conference we were just at. And my kind of knee-jerk response every time I get it is, well, first off, how few Jews is too few to care about? And second off, God called me there, so what difference does it make how many are there? There's at least enough that God cares about, but hey, there's also more people that aren't Jewish that God also cares about. So, Rabbi Toby, I know you were about to jump in right as I started to say something, so I'll let you dive.
What I liked about it was, I grew up in the church, the Baptist church, until I was about 25. I wasn't really going anywhere for like a year as far as like a fellowship or a congregation church, or I didn't know what Messianic Judaism was. It was my dad that had heard about it, because my dad was also, he didn't know what Messianic Judaism was, but he suddenly got this, literally it just kind of happened out of nowhere. He got this insatiable desire to read about all things Jewish and give to a Jewish organization. He just suddenly became like a compulsion. And he found out through someone at his job about what is known as a Messianic synagogue. Goes, well, it's a synagogue that believes in Jesus. And my dad was like, oh wow, so I can go to a Jewish synagogue and be around people that believe foundationally what I believe about salvation and about God. So he went, and when he came back, I still had never heard of it. So when my dad told me about it, I just was initially just like, oh, well, that's cool, Dad. That sounds really great. I was still kind of ambivalent about it, But then I couldn't stop thinking about it either. It's just what God does, you know. It's kind of so. I was not attending a church. My mom and I and my sister were particularly looking for a place to worship, though. And I just said, you know what? And I said, Mom, my dad never talks. Dad never cries. He never gets emotional. I said, but every time he talks about this particular place, this Messianic synagogue, he gets emotional and he gets all teary-eyed and stuff. I said, there's got to be something to it, you know. So we went, and that was it. But what struck me was I didn't understand. It really wasn't even the Jewishness that pulled me in. It was the presence of God. So that was the first thing which I'm excited about. So it wasn't like I just was like I had this interest in Judaism. So I got there and I got to this synagogue and I just knew that I was supposed to be there. But what I liked was the authenticity in the sense that it was this return to a stripped down originality of what the body of Messiah was, or what we know as the church or the Messianic community, before Rome got involved and before it became, I guess, what we know as the Christian church. And I'm not saying, I'm not criticizing it, but I was drawing no power from that. That doesn't mean that people don't draw power from the Christian church, but for me individually, it was this return to how it was being done in the first century. And so what I liked was the authenticity. And then of course I then started to fall in love with Judaism. The Talit was particularly something that I thought was these guys were wearing talits. I didn't know what they were. Just like, wearing these things around their shoulders, but I thought it just looked so beautiful to me. So God was definitely calling out to me through those things. And the more I learned about it, the more I came to love Judaism and came to love the Judaic pillars of what is still, I guess, if you want to call it the Christian faith or the faith itself, is still very Jewish, even for people who go to church on Sunday and do Christmas and Easter. They're still connected to an olive tree, right, through faith. But I love, and then it was hearing the Hebrew. The first time I ever heard Hebrew was in a Messianic synagogue. I'd never heard other than the word shalom. That was the only Hebrew word I knew. But when I heard liturgy, I'm standing. Now listen, I have cried in church, usually over Jesus forgiving Peter or Jesus being crucified and things like that. Those things moved me, and they should move you. Jesus forgiving Peter, Yeshua forgiving Peter, Yeshua's sacrifice, everything he went through. That there should be nothing more that moves your soul than those things. But I found myself in the synagogue, and when I'm visiting, hearing like the Shema and stuff, and I don't even know fully what I'm hearing, or I don't comprehend fully what I'm listening to, but I feel like it was everything in me to keep from busting out crying. I didn't understand why. It was because God was just calling out to me through that stuff, and I was just falling in love with it, not even fully understanding what it is. So, went back every Saturday. I mean, I've not looked back since August of 2005. But the point is, that was what I loved about it. And that's what I still love about it. That's still what I love about Messianic Judaism. That's not changed, which God has been very gracious in that's not gotten away from me. What God revealed to me, it was God to me. It was two parties, God and me. Of course, I've met incredibly wonderful people along the journey. But that is what will always love about Messianic Judaism is the authenticity of it's a revival of what it was like before. The faith became, I think, very Western Roman infused, and of course much more fractured with all the denominations and things like that. What I don't like, Rabbi Eric's already pretty much said it. It's when so much focus is on being Jewish, to the point where it just, whether what's fueling it is trying to be a part of a Jewish community that you want to accept you when they don't even accept the Messiah. So I don't even know why you want to, why that becomes such a goal, or just because there is this belief that because the Jewish people were chosen first, they were God's firstborn, or God's chosen people, that they're somehow head and shoulders above everyone else. Like, well, there's everybody, and then there's the Jewish people. Whether the Jewish elitism, which I don't run into everywhere I go, but I will say there's nary, I don't even know if that's even the right word, nary. But there is rarely, I can, I've been going to conferences and stuff for 20 years. And I'm not bringing any kind of particular, because I've experienced, whatever the organization is.
It's across the board.
It doesn't matter whether it's this acronym or that acronym. I've been to their conferences and I've had some conversation where somebody has said something that makes me feel like crap. Because I'm a Gentile, it used to really devastate me. Now it's more of like a pinprick. I still don't like it. I think it's garbage. And now I don't let it spiritually debilitate me like it used to, because God's brought me a long way. Now I'm just like, okay, I'm really tired of having to step over this crap, though. And this needs to get picked up.
Right.
And so, which is interesting to me, because not getting into theology and stuff, but it's like, you do understand that God did not save the Jewish people solely because they were like, they're direct. God made a promise to Abraham about his descendants, and we knew that was going to come true. But interestingly enough, when you get into like the Exodus, I was talking to somebody about this recently, and they were like, man, I've never thought of that. And I was like, yeah, I hadn't thought about it either until I read it, and I felt like the Lord kind of brought the words off the page. But if you go to the Passover, the first one, when God was destroying the firstborn of Egypt, he said to Israel, he didn't say, because you're descendants of Abraham, just stay where you're at. I'm going to pass through. I'm going to strike Egypt down. They had to do something. No, they had to do something. They had to take blood from a lamb and they had to apply it to the crossbeam and the doorposts of their homes. Which tells me, if there was a person in Goshen, an Israelite, that didn't do that, they died. So it's not just that. So my thing is that you do understand that your fleshly descendancy from Abraham does not purchase you salvation, right, or anything. God said, when I see the blood, I'm going to pass over. So there had to be an act of faith. So descendancy from Abraham wasn't enough, because otherwise God just would have said, park yourself in your homes, don't go outside, I'm going to go through Egypt. But there wasn't. God said, do this, apply the blood. Right, so that's just kind of a little aside there, but that's just the kind. But those are the kind of things that's how God brought me above getting spiritually and emotionally in shambles because somebody turned their nose up at me or said something that was just beyond insensitive. Like, are you Jewish? No. Well, you're still a good guy. Don't worry. Yep, somebody told me that in Dallas, Texas. Or, the more recent thing that all four of us know about that I'm not going to go into. But, I mean, I'm talking about, this was like last month. I'm like, I thought I was beyond this. I'm 44. Why am I still hearing this crap? Yeah. For 20 years I've been hearing this. That's what I don't like. That's probably the only thing I don't like. That one thing is enough to not like, where I don't really need, the other stuff is just an annoyance. But I did tell the person that I spoke to last month who said something really insensitive to me. He apologized later. And I said to him, this Gentile thing, I said, until it gets figured out, this movement is a slog. I said, just letting you know. Oh, I agree. Do you? Well, we'll see. But that's it. Yeah, so.
Depends on how your manners are and how big your pocketbook is.
I guess. I don't know. But, I mean, it doesn't change how I feel about the movement, about Messianic Judaism.
Yeah. Probably the thing that...
Yeah.
Probably the thing that drew me in, kind of grabbed me initially, and I will say, and this is not necessarily just something that Messianics are capable of. Every human being is capable of hospitality and kindness. And that was really the thing that probably brought me in and kind of captured my mind when I first started attending a Messianic congregation. The first place I did attend was Dothan Messianic Fellowship in Dothan, Alabama. And it was just, an overwhelming amount of hospitality and kindness. People who were, very happy to see that you were there on Shabbat. They were like, "We're so glad you're here. Please come in. Glad to have you worshiping with us today. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask." And just, people wanting to ensure that you felt like you could be there and, fully participate as who you were, wherever you came from, whatever you were doing. And of course, I experienced the same thing coming to Bradam when I visited Bradam the first time years ago now. And it's been, and again, it is rooted, and it's a little more expressive in Messianic Judaism. I think just because we do have more of a tie to the behavior and life of Abraham, and that there is this expectation that hospitality is something that should be constantly practiced and given to those who come, maybe not even looking for it. Maybe they just kind of showed up and were, maybe don't quite feel comfortable coming in, but it should be given nonetheless. And so that was sort of the thing that really grabbed my attention within Messianic Judaism. And at first, initially, there's other things too. The focus of liturgy. That was something that really grabbed me coming in, that there was an order to the prayer service, and that, we had there was an intentionality that this is the prayer service, and we do it this way for these reasons. We do it this way to mirror the temple structure, the temple service, the service of sacrifice. This is why we do it. So, and I remember that just really grabbed hold of my heart and my mind, and it was something that I became. It was what really drew me into learning Hebrew, because the liturgy in both Dothan and Bradam is done in Hebrew and in English, and so I really wanted to know. Okay, I know English, I want to know Hebrew too. So that led me into learning Hebrew. But yeah, the kindness of your people definitely can make or break a congregation, and it can determine the lifespan of a congregation as well. If your congregation is filled with people who are just kind of rude, maybe they're not go out of their way to be mean, but if they're just kind of rude and snide, visitors, then you may not be around terribly long. So dislike. I severely dislike the lack of normative authority. And we have talked about this, we did a whole series on should the Messianic movement continue to be associated with a fellowship model, or should it lean into developing a denominational model? I'm not going to speak for everyone here, but if my opinion hasn't been made clear already, I'm much in favor of the denominational model, solely for prescribing normative authority. Just because it provides accountability, it provides the space where other leaders can keep the leaders under them in check. That there is responsibility of those in authority to discipline those who stray, to advise the under leaders, the under shepherds, and how to discipline their own flock should they need it. And it is sometimes needed. I mean, some of the problems we have in the greater movement could be avoided if they had just been advised by someone over them. It's like, no, the heretic needs to be put out. Don't let them stay in your congregation and cause problems. Don't love them through this. You can love them through it while they're elsewhere, but not there. So that's probably the one thing, probably the top thing for me that I dislike, is that there is an aversion to normative authority, to having any kind of structure. And part of that's just cultural. Part of that's because, the Messianic movement really is birthed. The resurgence of Messianic Judaism really is birthed in America. And Americans are inherently, we do not care for someone above us. We do not care for authority. Which is, again, something we have to work on spiritually.
Yeah, and I think if I could jump in just a little, and is that I think if we had a more structured Messianic Judaism, we would not, because the truth is that many of the names of the people that have fallen in different problems or had bad media things going on are not normative part of the Messianic movement, but because they're connected in some way, loosely, or because not everybody who's a Jewish believer in Yeshua is connected fully with the Messianic movement. Many are actually part of a Christian church somewhere, or part of a Hebrew roots movement, or part of something else outside of the mainstream Messianic movement, where if there was a more formal structure of these are the people that are within us, and those are people that are outside of us, then when something happened, we wouldn't take the hit as if their actions represent who we are, rather than people saying, okay, they may be a Jewish believer, or they may be Hebrew roots, or they may be this, but we're not going to attach that to this group because they didn't even attach to them.
Right. I think obviously we've seen some, over the last couple of years, we've seen some what I would call pretty positive steps in certain organizations within Messianic Judaism to having more of a structure, which is good. It's positive. But it's still, we're not quite there yet. And I think there's a lot of problems that we could avoid, I think, if that was the case.
Yeah. I think one of the most discouraging things is, I don't even know if I want to say discouraging. I don't know how I feel about it, but it's weird, I guess. I guess I feel weird when I hear that most Jewish believers are in church.
Yeah. I'm
just kind of like, oh, okay. I guess from my perspective, just because I was called to Messianic Judaism, like I see so much of the beauty and the merit. Mm-hmm. So I'm kind of like, why? I don't know. That kind of bothers me. That's kind of weird,
Well, I think it's numbers for one. But there's more churches.
It was kind of mentioned in this earlier episode, but like in 20 years, I have experienced how drastically a service or a rabbi or some leader will act if they know a Jewish person or a Jewish family that doesn't accept Yeshua is in the audience or in the congregation. That whether they're visiting or, hey, it's a Jewish person. There's a Jewish person there. Okay, so I'm like, okay, and either something will change, they'll act differently. It just everybody's static antennas come out, and I'm like, you do understand the gospel does not need your help to like crank it up for a person. Right. It's the gospel, the power to save the Jew and the non-Jew. But what I'm saying is that I think that bothers me too. And I think it was mentioned. It's like, or oh my gosh, if somebody is from Israel, it doesn't matter what they believe. Bring them. We're going to let them speak. They're from Israel. Really?
It's like, who is this guy?
No, my wife had an experience where
he juggles in Jerusalem. It's like, why?
No, so okay. Get up and move out of his way because he's from Haaretz. And here's the thing: my wife had an experience where they had an Israeli guy at a place.
Yeah,
and they brought him in. Oh, he was from Israel, so everyone was just going banana cakes over this guy. And then the guy gets up and starts promoting a two-state solution. Good job, guys.
Yeah.
There's goofy people everywhere, including Israel, including Haaretz. So I get tired of, they're Jewish, right? So, okay, what do you want me to do? What do you want me to do?
Yeah.
It's interesting when we
You don't have to double the length of your sermon. There's a Jewish person here. They've got to hear the gospel.
Right. When we've had, and we've been blessed at Burdom to have a number of members.
Yeah, but do you know what I mean, though?
Yeah,
what I'm talking
of
about?
the conservative synagogue in town and
Yeah.
the Reform temple that have come to our congregation for various things. For instance, last week we had a bat mitzvah, and we know there was a member of the Reform temple that was in our service.
Right.
Now, we didn't change a thing.
Right.
We
shouldn't.
didn't. When the rabbi of the conservative synagogue worshipped with us for several weeks last year before he moved to New Orleans, we didn't change a word. We didn't.
Yeah.
It wasn't like we had to fit more Yeshua into our service or take some of it out to make it Yeshua light,
water it down.
or
Yeah.
all the message less
Right.
less the whatever.
When I worked at Chick-fil-A, which is a job that I only got because I wanted to eat, that you could eat as much as you wanted. I was 22, and I was like the oldest person that worked there because it was all kids like in high school,
Yeah.
And I didn't care. I was just in the back goofing around, whatever. I didn't care. I probably had the same maturity level as them at that point.
Yeah.
But if someone from corporate pulled up, and it was always around Christmas time, people from corporate would come and order the big nugget platters. And I had this manager, and she was like, Chick-fil-A is the greatest thing ever. Like, don't even throw away the sandwich wrappers. Just you have to. They're plates. She was that kind. She was like from the church of Chick-fil-A. She comes in. And she goes.
Anoint him with the sauces.
She goes, the person that's pulling up to get this nugget platter is from corporate. So I want big nuggets. No, not those. And I'm like, we want, that's what they do. We do that at Messianic synagogues when a non-believing Jewish person walks in. We're like, guys, a Jewish person is here. This is now what we're doing.
Yeah, that's the same as when I worked at Winn-Dixie. I was a manager with Winn-Dixie for years. And whenever somebody from the corporate office was coming up, everybody be like rushing around like busy bees, cleaning and and doing everything. And they would ask me, "Aren't you going?" I said, "No, they don't shop here."
It's funny because we do that, and Toby's right, like 100%. But it's funny, and we're always told, we grow up with this thing like you address the problem as it is. Mm-hmm. There is no special like formula for dealing with Jewish people. Honestly, 90% of the time, you know what the formula is. You know what the formula is for giving the gospel to Jewish people. Same one you use for atheists,
right?
Because that's what most of them are.
Yeah. The gospel doesn't have it does its own work. Right?
So here's you guys talking about corporate coming in. All it made me think. Even better example is you really want to watch this play out. Like the way it looks from the outside. You really want to watch this play out. Go to your favorite restaurant, your favorite coffee shop, look at their health board certificate with their score on it, and look at the date when it was issued. And then in about 3 months on that date and every day until it changes, which will usually be within about 5 or 6 days of that date every quarter, on that date in about 3 months, start going back to that exact same date. If it's January 3rd that you see is the date where they got their testing done, on April 3rd, start showing up again and go in every single day till you see that sheet change, and watch how much different the way that they do things is when they're expecting for the health inspector to come in, right? When you have that expectation that that's about to happen, you really start to do things the right way. Yeah. Now, I'm just going to throw it out and say the health board's right way is not always the right way. It's the less litigious way, right? And so just because they're not following every little single thing it doesn't mean that they're not doing things the right way.
Right.
But just watch, you'll see, and that's how we tend to do things. Like Rabbi Toby is saying, that's how we tend to do things. Is it's like a Jewish person comes in for the first time, and the immediate brains, the health inspectors, everybody, make sure you're washing your hands, make sure you're doing that, make sure we're pronouncing this correct, make sure we're doing that. How about I don't know, maybe we just do things the right way to begin with. And then we just let God do His thing.
Yeah, I forget whether it was. I think it was Toby who talked about the authenticity of the faith. if we're authentic, if we're who we are, regardless of who's in the audience, if you start sharing Yiddish expressions only because there's a Jewish person in the audience. Now realize that if you're in Pensacola, Florida, the possibility of a Jewish person walking in being fluent in Yiddish
or knowing anything more than the words you shouldn't be using in Yiddish in your sermon.
Yeah, except for the words that they heard on sitcoms on television.
It's about 1 in 10.
That is limited. But if you're putting on the shtick because a Jewish person entered your building, then you're being fake.
Yeah, you're acting in the way they're going that many accuse us of, which is a wolf in sheep's clothing.
And the truth is, if they're in your building, they're largely there to find something other than what they already have.
Yeah, so you're already working from
you're working from a good place before you change what you're doing so that you can be something you're not in hopes that you'll be what they want, which isn't what they came for.
Yeah, plus every time you change something last second to put on the show, you're instantly not going to do it right because of the fact that it's not ingrained in who you are and what you do.
Just going to be weird.
Yeah.
You're already weird enough. Don't.
So one of the things that, and so I guess we kind of frame this as what are things that
we like,
drew you to Messianic Judaism? What are things that keep you in Messianic Judaism? And then also what are things that we can improve? And one of the things that I really appreciate about Messianic Judaism as a whole is, and I agree 100%, we've done a number of episodes on the need for a more formalization of our organizations, whether we want to call it a denomination or not. There's a need for a more formalization, so there's at least some baseline across the board. But one of the things that I love, and I think that can be done while also allowing this, is that there is not a uniformity to the congregations, right? So and I think that's important because not every community that God calls somebody to start a Messianic congregation in is going to identify with a congregation that is more Orthodox or more Reform or more, whatever. And so the fact that there's room for autonomy for each congregation to represent Messianic Judaism as the community God plants them in actually needs, rather than trying to cookie cutter Messianic Jewish congregations all over the place, I think is beautiful, right? So you can go to a Messianic congregation and there are a number that are very much more Orthodox leaning in the way they do things. Not saying they're Orthodox, but very much more Orthodox leaning in the way they do things in their communities. Some don't have musical accompaniment with instrument accompaniment with their music, or don't use music at all. They just do liturgy, and they'll only do I know that there's congregations that literally will go through the entire Shabbat Shachrit service in their Shabbat morning service, and that's beautiful. That's great. That's awesome. And then there are places that doesn't work, and it's not going to. So, I love that in our area. Our congregations are within about 40, 45 minutes of each other, door to door. Assuming idiots on the interstate stop idioting, and it doesn't take longer than it should. But nonetheless, but we're in pretty much the same kind of areas. They're very beachy, very touristy, that kind of a thing, and generally speaking, most Messianic congregations are not going to be able to do the Orthodox thing in their communities, primarily because, as Rabbi Eric said, I think it was you that said it, most Jews aren't looking for that, right? If you look at, even if we lump Reconstructionist, Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, and Hasidic into one lump sum, you're still talking and calling that the religious side of Judaism, which honestly, some of those really aren't so religious, but we call that the religious side of Judaism. The truth of the matter is all of that as one lump sum is still something less than 2% of the Jewish community of America. And honestly, I think it's really less than 1%. I'm being gracious here. It's less than 2%. So in our area where CMC is, there's about 20 to 25,000 Jewish people in the two counties that we primarily interact with. Out of that, the Reform and Conservative Synagogue in their on-books membership. Their on-books membership, not people that show up on a regular basis, just their on-book membership represents about 1,000 people between those two congregations. So you're talking 19 to 24,000 Jewish people that are not represented by those two forms of quote-unquote religious Judaism because they don't want that. They're not looking for that hyper-traditional service. They're not looking for that kind of a thing. And I don't think that Messianic congregations need to necessarily be specifically what people are looking for, but I think that you need to that God's got to give your congregation an identity for the area He's placed you in. And so in our congregation, and you guys are very, very similar in the way you do things, we are rather liturgical, but we're also very free in worship. We're very open to letting God do what God's going to do. We follow a traditional format in the way that our liturgy is laid out throughout our service, but we also allow for God to move within that. There's some flux. There's some moving that's available in there and such. And part of that is because the model, the flow of the service is very familiar. Even if you don't go to synagogue, but maybe once a year, or you only go when there's a bar bat mitzvah in your family that you got to go for, the flow of the service is something recognizable, and so you don't immediately feel out of place, even if you don't go to synagogue on a regular basis. But it's not so rigid and structured that you feel like this is what I was trying to get away from forever. And so there's that connectivity, right? And so the fact that Messianic Judaism, there is that autonomy for the individual congregations to be who they need to be in the community they're in, some much more traditional leaning, some more lax in the way that they interact with tradition and stuff in their congregation, but all still following under the same umbrella and having kind of the baseline of theology and such, I think is beautiful. And one of the things that really, I think, excites me for Messianic Judaism. Now, that doesn't mean that I agree with everybody involved in those umbrellas, but I think it's an important thing to say, hey, this is a good thing that there is room for that variance there. And depending on where you are, sometimes that's much more needed than others. There's not a cookie cutter formula for each and every community. And I think it's important to understand that that's a very Jewish thing too. There's a traditional order to the liturgy, but you don't necessarily have to do every piece that's found within that order. Right. And some of it you can't do under certain circumstances and so on and so forth if you're following it very strictly. And so there is already that kind of built-in allowance there. And so I really appreciate that there's that lack of uniformity, though we're all tied together and are following kind of the same flow and structure and such. One of the things that I think we could do a lot better with, and I think that this is something that I've voiced a lot, and not only on the podcast, but that I've voiced a lot in our circles that we interact with on a regular basis, is that we really have to do better about raising people up to carry the mantle, because we've talked about it before, and we actually, I think, talked about it either earlier in this episode or maybe it was in the last one, where we dealt with the fact that most of the pioneer leaders of the Messianic movement are unfortunately fading off into the sunset, but there's also generally not a follow-up of leadership after them. There's not a generation of leadership coming in to take over where they built and to build on from there. And I'm afraid what's going to happen is that in the next 10 to 20 years max, in the next 10 to 20 years, my generation, or our generation, the three of us, and the generation behind us are going to have to really step into a pioneering mindset again to re-pioneer, repave the roads, because there wasn't enough forethought in the pioneering side of things to establish a future. There was a gung-ho, let's get this moving, let's do this, let's get this rolling, and God bless, because that's why we are where we are. But there was, I would venture so far to say that up until recent years, there wasn't a focus of stewarding for the future that which has been built. And what it's left now is a potential for a large vacuum in leadership when that unfortunate time does come, which is happening like dominoes little by little as they move across the board. So I think for me, that's one of the big areas that we definitely need a lot of improvement in, is building up, raising, empowering, positioning a future for the Messianic movement. And from my own opinion, take it, leave it, do what you want with it. For my own opinion, I think that we need to recognize, and this kind of loops back to something we talked about earlier that Rabbi Toby brought up. I think the reality is we need to recognize, own the fact, and rejoice in the fact that part of that future includes non-Jews carrying the mantle of Messianic Judaism with a Ruth-like heart, who are willing to say, hey, your God is my God, your people are my people. Where you go, I will go. Because the reality is, in Messianic Judaism, those are the nations who have attached themselves to what Messianic Judaism is, that God has brought in. When, for lack of a better way of wording it, when the crap hits the fan, they're catching the same flack we're catching from those that hate us. They're taking the same sacrifices, they're making the same, and their heart is in it just as much, and I honestly would say in a lot of ways more so than those of us who happen to have the genetic makeup to call ourselves Jewish. I think we need to realize that a major part of the Messianic movement, not only moving forward, but also in fulfilling its call, its purpose of reaching the Jewish world and the nations, is that it takes both Jews and the nations working together within Messianic Judaism for that to happen. And I just dropped my phone on the floor like an idiot.
Anyhow, we hope that this has been a blessing to you. I guess if we're going to title this one, it's called The Things That Led Me to Messianic Judaism and the Things That Didn't Chase Me Away at This Point.
Yeah.
And things that we'd like to see advanced, things that we'd like to see improved, but at the same time recognizing that there is a power and a strength within Messianic Judaism that it does draw people, both Jewish and non-Jewish.
And that keeps them.
And keeps them in community. If you have a topic you'd like for us to discuss in a further episode, please let us know by connecting either through the podcast formats that you're listening on or through our social media. And we will see you again next week. Shalom.
Thank you for listening to the Messiantics podcast. Make sure to subscribe so you can be notified every time we drop a new episode. And be sure to follow and interact with us on social media at Messiantics Podcast.